Hello students, this is Mrs. Pateris, and we're here to go over a very short PowerPoint to review and add to our knowledge of redaction criticism. Now remember, when we say criticism, we mean we're analyzing something to try to better understand it. Now we've talked about criticism before. The definition of redaction criticism regards the author of the text as the editor of the source material. So it's not looking at the various parts of the story to discover the original purpose, but rather it focuses on how the redactor or editor has shaped and molded the story to express his theology. So you should be filling in the blanks on your incomplete notes here, noting that the author is the editor and that the choices that he makes express his own theology. Now, we've also seen source criticism before. That's when we had our modified two-source hypothesis that we put on the board with all the arrows. Source criticism is focusing on finding the sources the author used in constructing his or her text, the works cited page, if you will. Redaction criticism, however, focuses on the choices the author makes in constructing the final form and how that final form expresses the author's theology. Basically, we're saying, why would the author choose to make this change, and what does that tell us about the beliefs at that time? Thus, redaction criticism examines the editing and constructing process. The goal of redaction criticism is to reconstruct the theology of each author. Now, rather than being concerned with the original form, which is form criticism, something we won't get into, we are looking with redaction criticism at the meaning of the final form. So here are the things that you want to look for when you're conducting redaction criticism, which is something you're going to be asked to do in your homework today. The first thing you focus on is what is different. When you find that difference, you ask yourself, why do you think the author chose to change that? Finally, you consider, what does this tell us, this change, about the author or the audience's theology? So for example, grab your Bible, and I'm going to ask you to look up 4 passages. Now, don't be deterred by the fact that I only put 1 T in Matthew instead of 2. You'll still be able to do this. What I want you to do is look up these various verses and figure out what is different and how Jesus is described in each of these passages. So go ahead and look up Mark chapter 6, verse 3, Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 to 56, Luke chapter 4, verse 22, and John chapter 6, verse 42, remembering that these were written in this order. Keeping that in mind, consider what you think is the purpose or meaning of this change over time. So please pause the video now and do this. Welcome back. Here are the results of what you just looked up. We notice that in Mark it says, "Is not this the carpenter?" referring to Jesus, as if Jesus is the carpenter. In Matthew, however, the change is made, "Is not this the carpenter's son?" showing Jesus as the son of the carpenter. Then in Luke, we see the change, "Is this not Joseph's son?" taking out the concept of carpenter and just indicating Jesus as the son of Joseph, which we also see in John's gospel, "Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph?" So the question becomes, why make this change? And the purpose or meaning here is that over time we see that our authors try to distance Jesus from the lower social rank of carpenter. Would not have been held in very high regard at this time. And so in our first gospel written, we see Jesus associated as the carpenter, but as time passes, the distance between Jesus being the carpenter to the carpenter's son, to the son of Joseph, where being a carpenter isn't even mentioned, then we would consider why they might want to do this. Lots of possible reasons, but basically over time, they're trying to show Jesus is more important and more powerful than being associated with this lower social rank. So let's try this again. I've got two passages here of the story of stilling the storm from Mark and from Matthew. So take a moment or two here, read these two, and again remember the first thing you're looking for is what is different. Then you ask yourself, why do you think the author chose to change that? And finally, what does this tell us about the author or the audience's theology? So pause the video and take a moment on your incomplete notes, which have the same passages on them, and see what you can find that is different. Welcome back. Let's talk about the differences that you've found here. Now, there are a lot of differences. I'm only going to point out one or two. The biggest difference is that in the Gospel of Mark, the fear of the disciples comes after the miracle. So what they're afraid of, really, is Jesus. And it shows their lack of faith and understanding, because we know that Mark likes to illustrate blind disciples. So you see that at first, everything's calm. Then Jesus asks them why they are afraid after the storm has been calmed. And then it says they were filled with great fear as they said to each other, "Who then is this that even wind and sea obey him?" Whereas in Matthew, the fear comes before the calming of the storm, showing us that what the disciples are afraid of in Matthew is the storm, versus in Mark where they're afraid of Jesus. And then the disciples cry out to Jesus, "Lord, save us!" And Jesus does save them. So this focuses on the power of Jesus as well as the faithfulness of the disciples, who are marveling at Jesus' power, who say at the end, marveling rather than being afraid, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and sea obey him?" Notice it's the same wording, but very different in Matthew, because the disciples who are faithful, the disciples who follow Jesus at the beginning, are marveling and believing in Jesus. They believe Jesus can save them and does save them. Versus in Mark, where they're afraid of Jesus, where they're blind and confused. Lots more details that are different, but that just gives you an idea. So, how does this impact your homework? Well, if you look at the incomplete notes we've been going through, you will see on the next page I've given you 4 different sections where you're going to be comparing Matthew and Mark just like you did here on this video. You're always going to be trying to find the differences, and then also to consider what these differences can tell us about our authors and about the theology of our audience. There'll be some conclusions, but you don't have to write anything down for that, because we'll do that in class. But then, on the next page, you'll notice we're also going to look at a few parables of vigilance found in Matthew's Gospel. And rather than have all of you read all 7 of those parables, if your last name starts with the letter A through M, just do the first 4 stories. So Matthew chapter 24, verses 32 to 33, as well as verses 37 to 41, as well as verses 42 to 44, and finally Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. If your last name starts with N through Z, you're going to do the stories marked as numbers 4 through 7. That means everyone's going to be reading Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30, and then those with the last name of N through Z will also read Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 to 13, Matthew chapter 24, verses 45 to 51, and Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. For each of the 4 stories that you're going to summarize, You want to briefly summarize what happened, but then list what you think is the theme or main idea of the story. So when you come into our next class, you should have answered the 4 questions comparing the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, as well as the 4 stories of the parables of vigilance from the Gospel of Matthew that are assigned to you based on your last name. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.